My name is Diane, and I'm 32 years old. The moment my sister's wealthy boyfriend asked what I did for a living, I watched my father's face tighten and my mother's wineglass pause midway to her lips. The crystal chandelier above our family dining table suddenly felt too bright, illuminating every uncomfortable shift in their expressions. My father leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp with warning, while my mother forced out a brittle laugh that echoed too loudly in the sudden silence. Then she said it, those 4 words that would change everything. "Don't embarrass us, Diane." My sister Bethany smirked from across the table, clearly enjoying my discomfort, while Preston waited politely for an answer that my parents desperately hoped I wouldn't give. Before we dive into what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. If you're ready to hear how one dinner conversation exposed my family's darkest secrets and turned my entire world upside down, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you won't believe where this story goes. Now, let's get into what happened when I decided to answer that question honestly. Growing up in our wealthy Connecticut suburb was like living in a perfectly staged photograph where I was always slightly out of frame. My sister Bethany, 4 years younger than me at 28, had been the golden child from the moment she was born. While I spent my teenage years studying in my room, Bethany was crowned homecoming queen, became sorority president at her prestigious university, and landed a marketing manager position at a firm that my parents constantly bragged about to their country club friends. Everything about Bethany seemed to sparkle in a way that I never could, at least not in our parents' eyes. She had the right friends, the right job, the right everything. My father Howard, now 61, had spent 35 years climbing the corporate ladder before retiring as an executive vice president at a major financial services company. My mother Constance, 58, had been a socialite who dedicated her retirement years to maintaining the family's status in our affluent community. They had built what they considered the perfect life in their massive colonial house, with its manicured gardens and 3-car garage. My childhood memories were filled with moments of watching Bethany receive new cars, expensive jewelry, and endless praise while I got practical gifts and lukewarm acknowledgement. When Bethany turned 16, they bought her a brand new luxury sedan with a giant bow on top. When I turned 16, I got their old used car with a card that said, "Be responsible." Every dance recital, every soccer game, every school play that Bethany participated in had both parents in the front row with cameras and flowers. My debate team championships and academic awards ceremonies were attended sporadically, if at all, with my father usually checking his watch and my mother commenting that we needed to leave early for some social obligation. The dinner that night was supposed to be a formal introduction of Preston, Bethany's boyfriend of 6 months, to the extended family circle before a larger gathering planned for the following month. Preston was 35, an investment banker with the kind of pedigree and portfolio that made my parents practically salivate. From the moment he walked through the door in his tailored suit, my mother had been fawning over him, while my father engaged him in conversations about market trends and investment strategies. Bethany glowed beside him, her hand possessively on his arm, her diamond bracelet catching the light with every gesture. I had been invited almost as an afterthought, my mother calling me 3 days before to say, "I suppose you should come too," in a tone that made it clear I was an obligation rather than a desire. I had arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, wearing a simple navy dress that I thought was appropriate for a family dinner. My mother's first words after opening the door were, "Oh, Diane, is that really what you're wearing?" followed by a disappointed sigh. My father had looked me up and down and commented, "Well, at least you're finally dressing appropriately for once," which I understood to mean my clothes were boring enough not to draw attention. Bethany had greeted me with a cool "hey" before immediately turning back to Preston, and the entire evening had carried that same undercurrent of tension, as if my very presence was something to be managed and minimized. The dinner conversation had flowed around me like I was a rock in a stream, with my parents directing all their attention and questions toward Preston and Bethany, discussing vacation homes, investment properties, and the guest list for upcoming charity galas that I hadn't even been invited to attend. Then Preston, perhaps sensing the strange family dynamic or perhaps just making polite conversation, turned to me with genuine curiosity in his eyes and asked, "So Diane, what do you do for work? Your parents mentioned you live in the city." The question hung in the air like a grenade with its pin pulled. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, my mother's hand tightened around her wineglass until her knuckles went white, and Bethany's eyes went wide before narrowing into a knowing smirk. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in the span of a heartbeat. My mother let out that forced laugh, the one she used when someone at the country club said something inappropriate, and said, "Oh, Preston, let's not bore you with work talk," but he smiled politely and said, "No, really, I'm interested. I like to know what drives people." That's when my father leaned in, his voice low but firm, and said, "Diane, please don't embarrass us," and I understood in that moment exactly what they meant. I looked at my father's warning expression, then at my mother's pleading eyes, then at Bethany's smug face, and I made a decision. I set down my fork carefully, took a sip of water, and said in a clear, steady voice, "I'm a federal prosecutor. I work for the United States Attorney's Office in the Southern District." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of reaction across every face at the table. I continued, watching their expressions shift. "I specialize in white-collar crime and corporate fraud. I was recently promoted to lead a task force investigating financial crimes, and I've handled several high-profile cases over the past few years." Preston's eyebrows rose with genuine interest and respect, and he leaned forward in his chair with the first real smile of the evening. "That's impressive," Preston said, his tone warming considerably. "I actually follow a lot of the legal news related to financial sectors. Are you involved in any of the cases that have been in the headlines recently?" He started asking detailed questions about the legal process, about how investigations were structured, about the challenges of prosecuting complex financial crimes. For the first time that evening, someone at my parents' table was treating me like an intelligent, accomplished professional rather than an embarrassment to be hidden. I answered his questions professionally, careful not to discuss anything confidential, but explaining the general nature of my work and the types of cases my office handled. Preston seemed genuinely fascinated, mentioning specific cases he'd read about and asking insightful questions that showed he actually understood the financial mechanisms involved. Meanwhile, my mother had gone completely pale, her carefully applied makeup suddenly looking garish against her white face. My father sat frozen in his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitching in his cheek. Neither of them was making eye contact with me anymore. Instead, they kept exchanging glances with each other, quick worried looks that spoke of some shared secret. My mother attempted to downplay my career, her voice brittle as she said, "Well, yes, it's just government work really, nothing too exciting," but Preston cut her off, saying, "Actually, federal prosecutors are incredibly important. The work they do protects investors and maintains market integrity." Bethany had stopped smirking and now looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with her napkin and shooting worried glances at our parents. My father excused himself from the table, mumbling something about an important phone call, which was strange given it was 8 o'clock on a Saturday evening. I watched him walk quickly toward his home office, his phone already at his ear before Head even left the dining room. My mother tried desperately to change the subject, suggesting we move on to dessert even though we'd barely finished our main course. But Preston was still asking me questions about my career path and how I'd decided to go into prosecution. I answered honestly, explaining how I'd been drawn to the work because I'd seen too many people hurt by financial fraud, how I'd interned at the district attorney's office during law school, how I'd worked my way up from handling small fraud cases to leading major investigations. With each answer, my mother drank more wine, which was unusual for her since she typically limited herself to one glass at social gatherings, always concerned about maintaining perfect decorum. When my father returned 10 minutes later, his face was flushed and his forehead had a light sheen of sweat despite the cool temperature of the dining room. He suggested abruptly that we skip dessert and perhaps meet at a restaurant another time, which made no sense given that my mother had spent the entire afternoon preparing her famous chocolate torte specifically for this dinner. Bethany immediately agreed, saying she and Preston had early plans the next morning anyway, which was clearly a lie since Shed mentioned earlier that they were sleeping in and going to brunch. Preston looked confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere but was too polite to comment, simply thanking my parents for dinner and following Bethany's lead. My mother practically pushed them toward the door, her goodbyes rushed and her smiles strained to the breaking point. The entire carefully orchestrated evening had fallen apart, and I was absolutely certain it had everything to do with my revelation about my career. After Preston and Bethany left, I decided to stay behind, telling my parents I wanted to help clean up even though they employed a cleaning service. The truth was, I needed to understand what had just happened, why my simple, truthful answer about my career had caused such an extreme reaction. I'd known my parents were embarrassed by my career choice. They'd made that clear over the years with their dismissive comments and their reluctance to discuss my work at social gatherings. But this was different. This wasn't embarrassment. This was fear. I watched my father pace the length of the living room while my mother cleared the table with shaking hands, and I started mentally cataloging everything I'd noticed about their behavior over the past several months. My father was supposedly fully retired, yet had been taking mysterious meetings, leaving the house in business attire and returning hours later looking stressed and exhausted. My mother had mentioned investments several times in recent conversations, talking about how well their portfolio was doing, how they'd been able to help Bethany with a down payment on her condo, how they were considering buying a vacation property in the Bahamas. But something about the way Shed said it had felt off, too rehearsed, like she was trying to convince herself as much as inform me. I'd visited their house a month ago and noticed several new expensive items. A painting in the hallway that looked like original art worth tens of thousands of dollars. New furniture in the study, my mother wearing jewelry I'd never seen before. When I'd asked about it, they'd been vague, saying something about smart investments paying off. As a federal prosecutor specializing in financial crimes, I'd been trained to notice patterns, to see red flags that most people would miss. And as I stood in my parents' kitchen, watching my father avoid my eyes, and my mother pour herself yet another glass of wine, all those red flags started waving frantically in my mind. My father's nervousness mirrored exactly what I'd seen in suspects during interviews. That same rigid posture, that same tendency to over-explain simple things while being vague about important details. My mother's forced cheerfulness and constant deflection were classic signs of someone hiding something significant. The hushed phone conversations, the mysterious meetings, the sudden influx of wealth, the extreme reaction to learning about my specific job in financial crime prosecution, it all added up to something very wrong. I tried to approach the subject carefully, saying, "Is everything okay? You both seem really tense tonight," but my father immediately became defensive, his voice sharp as he said, "Everything is fine, Diane. Why must you always think the worst of people?" My mother added, "We're just tired, dear. It's been a long week even though it was Saturday and neither of them had worked in years." I pushed a little more, asking about their investments, about what they'd been doing with their retirement, and both of them shut down completely. My father told me I was being unnecessarily suspicious and that I needed to learn to turn off the prosecutor brain when I was with family. My mother actually started crying, saying, "Why can't you just trust us? Why do you always have to interrogate everyone?" They insisted everything was fine, that I was imagining problems, that my job had made me cynical and paranoid. Then they not so subtly suggested I should leave, my mother saying, "It's getting late even though it was barely 9 o'clock. My father already walking toward the door with my coat in his hands. I left that night with a knot in my stomach and a growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. I drove back to my apartment in the city, my mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. I told myself I was overreacting, that years of prosecuting criminals had made me see crime everywhere, but my instincts were screaming that this was real. The next morning, I was proven right in the worst possible way. I received a phone call at 7 a.m. from my supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. His voice grave as he told me that an anonymous complaint had been filed against me. The complaint alleged serious misconduct in one of my recent cases claiming I had fabricated evidence and violated the rights of a defendant. I was shocked, absolutely stunned, because I knew with complete certainty that the allegations were false. I had never, would never, compromise a case by manufacturing evidence or violating procedure. But the complaint was formal, detailed, and convincing enough that it couldn't be ignored. I was being placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The timing was impossible to ignore. The complaint had been filed the morning after my family dinner, just hours after Id revealed my position and specialty to Preston. Someone had moved quickly, had already had this plan in place, waiting for the right moment to execute it. As I sat in my apartment, reading through the formal notification of the investigation, I realized that my own family was targeting me. They weren't just embarrassed by my career. They were actively working to destroy it. And that could only mean one thing. I was a direct threat to something they were involved in, something criminal, something they were willing to sacrifice their own daughter to protect. My career that Eid spent 10 years building, my reputation that Eid worked so hard to establish, was suddenly in jeopardy because Eid told the truth at a family dinner. I spent the next week in a state of controlled panic, using every resource at my disposal to understand what was happening. I couldn't access my current case files due to the investigation, but I could look at public records. And that's exactly what I did. I started with the basics, searching for my father Howard's name in property records, business registrations, and corporate filings. What I found made my blood run cold. My father's name appeared on the ownership documents for 7 different limited liability companies, all formed within the past 3 years, all with vague names like Horizon Capital Partners and Summit Investment Group. My mother Constance was listed as an officer in an offshore company registered in the Cayman Islands, a company with no clear business purpose or legitimate explanation for its existence. I dug deeper, following the paper trail through shell companies and layered corporate structures, the exact type of financial maze I'd seen criminals use to hide the source and destination of illegal funds. The second attack came on a Tuesday morning when I tried to access my bank account to pay my rent and discovered all my accounts had been frozen. Within an hour, I received notification that the IRS was auditing my tax returns for the past 5 years. By that afternoon, I discovered that someone had maxed out my credit cards with fraudulent charges, thousands of dollars of purchases I'd never made at stores I'd never visited. Someone with access to sophisticated resources and detailed personal information was systematically dismantling my financial life. I filed identity theft reports, contacted my bank's fraud department, but the damage was already done. My credit score plummeted. My ability to access my own money vanished, and I was suddenly struggling to afford basic necessities. The next betrayal came from an unexpected source. My sister Bethany called me, her voice strange, almost guilty, as she asked how I was doing. I told her about the investigation and the financial attacks, and there was a long pause on the line. Then she said something that made my heart stop. "Maybe it's just family protecting itself, you know." I asked her what she meant, my voice sharp, and she immediately backtracked, claiming shed just meant that families go through hard times, that everything would work out. But before she hung up, she said, "Just back off, Diane, let it go." It wasn't advice, it was a warning. And it confirmed that my sister, my own blood, was actively involved in whatever scheme our parents were running. She wasn't an innocent bystander. She was a willing participant in my destruction. I contacted a lawyer friend who did some quiet digging and discovered the full scope of what my parents were involved in. My father, along with several business associates, had been running a Ponzi scheme for at least 3 years. They'd been targeting wealthy retirees and professionals in their social circle, promising returns of 15 to 20% annually through exclusive investment opportunities that didn't actually exist. The money from new investors was being used to pay fake returns to earlier investors, while the rest was being siphoned off through the network of shell companies I'd discovered. My mother's fake charitable foundation was being used as a front to legitimize the operation and recruit more victims. They'd stolen over $12 million from 47 different families, Many of them elderly people who'd invested their entire retirement savings based on my father's reputation and my parents' social standing in the community. The sickest part was how it connected to me. One of the criminal networks my task force had been investigating involved money laundering operations in the financial district, and it turned out that network was connected to my father's associates, who had been closing in on their operation from a different angle, investigating what we thought was an unrelated case, but we were actually getting closer to exposing my parents' scheme. They'd discovered my involvement weeks ago, probably through Preston, who had access to banking networks and insider information. That's when they'd decided I needed to be neutralized, not just discredited but completely destroyed professionally and financially, so that anything I said about them would look like the desperate accusations of a disgraced prosecutor. The third major attack came in the form of anonymous tips sent to my workplace, emails and letters claiming I'd accepted bribes in previous cases, that I'd been corrupt for years. False witnesses came forward with convincing but completely fabricated stories about my alleged misconduct. Forged documents began circulating that appeared to show financial transactions between me and defendants I'd prosecuted. Someone even created fake social media accounts in my name, posting inappropriate content, trying to make me look unprofessional and unstable. My professional reputation, built over a decade of honest work and successful prosecutions, was being systematically shredded by people who had unlimited resources and no conscience about destroying their own daughter to save themselves. And the most devastating part was that those people were my own parents, my own sister, all working together to eliminate the threat I represented to their criminal enterprise. The toll of the attacks became overwhelming. I was suspended from work indefinitely, under investigation by 3 different agencies, my bank accounts frozen, my credit destroyed, and I was living on a friend's couch because I couldn't afford rent. Former colleagues avoided me in the courthouse halls, their eyes sliding away when I tried to say hello. Professional contacts stopped returning my calls. Defense attorneys I'd faced in court were gleefully spreading rumors about my alleged corruption, using my situation to challenge convictions I'd secured. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, was crumbling around me, and my own family was wielding the sledgehammer. The emotional devastation was worse than the professional damage. This wasn't just about my career. This was about the fundamental betrayal of family bonds. The realization that the people who were supposed to love and protect me were willing to send me to prison to save themselves. I kept replaying my childhood in my mind, all those moments when I'd felt like I didn't quite belong, like I was somehow deficient compared to Bethany, and I realized with a sick clarity that I'd been right all along. I wasn't the beloved daughter. I was the expendable one. I was the child they could sacrifice without regret because I'd never been as valuable to them as their money, their status, their perfect life built on fraud and theft. Every dismissive comment, every missed event, every comparison to my sister, it had all been leading to this moment when they would choose crime over their own daughter without hesitation. My father called on a Wednesday afternoon, his voice calm and rational, as if we were discussing something reasonable. He said, "Diane, you need to understand what you were going to do to us. We built a good life. We gave you and your sister everything. You were going to ruin it all because of your rigid sense of right and wrong." My mother got on the line, her voice pleading, saying Bethany needs security for her future. She's not like you. She can't just make her own way. We were taking care of our family. They actually expected me to understand, to accept that defrauding elderly people out of their retirement savings was justified because it benefited Bethany. They blamed me for being in the way, for having the audacity to choose a career in prosecution, for being too ethical to ignore their crimes. There was no apology, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the real victims whose lives they'd destroyed. Just anger that I wouldn't back down and let them continue stealing. I spiraled into a depression that scared even me. I stopped eating regularly, surviving on coffee and whatever leftovers my friend Marisa brought home from work. I slept 16 hours a day, not because I was tired, but because being unconscious was better than being awake and facing the wreckage of my life. I stopped showering regularly, stopped changing clothes, stopped caring about anything because what was the point when your own parents were trying to put you in prison? My friends were worried, constantly checking on me, trying to get me to eat, to talk, to see a therapist, but I couldn't articulate the depth of the betrayal. How do you explain to someone that your mother and father, the people who raised you and supposedly loved you, were actively working to frame you for crimes they committed? How do you process that level of evil from people who shared your DNA? The fourth attack was the most insidious and the most dangerous. Forged documents surfaced that appeared to show I'd been a silent partner in my parents' schemes all along, that I'd used my position as a prosecutor to protect their operation and intimidate potential whistleblowers. The documents were sophisticated, with fake signatures that looked remarkably like mine, fabricated emails that appeared to come from my accounts, manufactured financial records that seemed to show I'd received payments from their shell companies. If these documents were believed, I wouldn't just lose my law license. I would face 20 to 30 years in federal prison for the very crimes I'd spent my career prosecuting. My parents weren't just trying to discredit me or ruin my career. They were trying to make me the scapegoat for their entire operation, to shift all blame onto me while they walked away free. I hit my lowest point on a Friday night, alone in my borrowed apartment, staring at copies of the fabricated evidence that had been sent to the ethics board. I looked at how thoroughly my parents had planned this, how they'd spent months planting evidence, building a false narrative, creating a comprehensive frame that would be difficult to disprove, even with the truth on my side. They were willing to send their own daughter to prison, to completely destroy my life, all to protect themselves and their precious Bethany. I thought about how easy it would be to just give up, to resign, to disappear somewhere and start over with a new name and a new life. I thought about how much simpler things would be if I just let them win, if I stopped fighting and accepted that some battles couldn't be won. I broke down completely that night, sobbing for hours, grieving not just for my lost career but for the family I'd never actually had, for the parents who'd never really loved me the way parents should love their children. But I didn't give up, and that was largely because of Marisa. Marisa had been my colleague at the U.S. Attorney's Office for 6 years, a fellow prosecutor who specialized in racketeering cases. She'd been one of the few people who'd refused to believe the allegations against me from the start, who'd looked at the accusations with a critical eye and found them implausible. While I was falling apart, Marisa was using her own time to investigate, following leads that official investigators were ignoring, looking for the inconsistencies and impossibilities in the case against me. She discovered that the anonymous complaints had all come from the same IP address, an address that belonged to Preston's investment banking firm. She found digital fingerprints in the forged documents, metadata that showed they'd been created recently rather than over the course of years as they were supposed to represent. Marisa brought her findings to me on a Monday morning, spreading printouts across the coffee table of my borrowed apartment, her face grim but determined. She'd traced the IP address through several proxy servers and found that Preston had direct access to the computers used to file the complaints against me. She'd discovered that Preston's investment banking firm specialized in creating sophisticated financial instruments and shell companies, exactly the kind of expertise needed to build and maintain a Ponzi scheme like the one my parents were running. The romantic relationship between Preston and Bethany wasn't a coincidence. It had been arranged, orchestrated, with Preston brought in specifically for his financial expertise and his access to money laundering tools. My sister's fairy tale romance was actually a criminal partnership. The second ally appeared the same day, and he was someone I'd never expected. Roland was a 41-year-old FBI agent who specialized in white-collar crime and financial fraud. Had been investigating the same criminal network that my task force was targeting, approaching it from a different angle through the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. When Head noticed the attacks on me, the timing and nature of them had raised red flags in his experienced mind. Someone was putting enormous resources into destroying a federal prosecutor, which suggested that prosecutor was getting close to something important. Roland had started his own quiet investigation, looking into my family, my connections, my recent cases, and had uncovered the links between my father's network and the larger criminal enterprise he was investigating. Roland came to my apartment accompanied by Marisa, his credentials in hand, his face serious but kind. He spread out his own investigation files, showing me surveillance photos of my father meeting with a man named Lester, surveillance that had been ongoing for 8 months as part of a larger federal investigation. Lester was the primary operator of the Ponzi scheme, a financial predator with 2 previous fraud convictions who'd been smart enough to stay under the radar for years. My father was one of his major partners, recruited because of his social connections and his reputation in wealthy circles. My mother had created the fake charitable foundation, using her social network to recruit younger investors through emotional appeals and charity events. And Bethany, my golden child sister, had been running her own parallel scheme through social media, targeting wealthy women with fake investment opportunities, stealing an additional $3 million independently. Roland also showed me documents from a victim named Geneva, a 72-year-old widow who'd lost her entire life savings to my father's scheme. Geneva had been meticulous, keeping detailed records of every interaction, every promise, every payment. She'd saved emails, recorded phone conversations, documented meetings, all because something had felt wrong to her, even as she was investing. When Shed finally realized she'd been defrauded, she'd taken everything to the FBI, providing a paper trail that was devastating to the defense of everyone involved. Geneva's evidence showed the entire structure of the fraud, named every participant, and proved beyond any doubt that this wasn't a failed investment, but a deliberate criminal conspiracy. And the dates on her records showed that the scheme had been operating for 3 years and 2 months, making it one of the longer-running Ponzi schemes Roland had investigated. Looking at the evidence, seeing the scope of what my parents had done and the real people they'd hurt, I felt something shift inside me. I'd been so focused on my own pain, my own betrayal, that I hadn't fully confronted the reality of their crimes. These weren't victimless financial crimes or abstract legal violations. These were real people, elderly couples who'd lost homes, widows who couldn't afford medication, families whose children's college funds had vanished. Geneva's records included heartbreaking details, like how Shed invested money her late husband had carefully saved for 40 years, how Shed trusted my father because Head seemed like such a respectable gentleman, how she was now living with her daughter because she couldn't afford rent. There were dozens of victims just like her, all betrayed by people they'd trusted, all suffering real consequences while my parents bought expensive art and jewelry. I made my decision in that moment. I told Roland and Marisa that I was done being a victim, done wallowing in self-pity, done letting my parents' attacks paralyze me. I was a federal prosecutor, trained and experienced in exactly these kinds of cases, and I was going to fight back. We formed a plan right there in that borrowed apartment, the 3 of us working together to build a case that would be absolutely unassailable. I would pretend to be broken, would let my parents think they'd won, would convince them I was backing down and giving up. Meanwhile, Roland would continue his FBI investigation from the outside, building the case through official channels. Marisa would handle the legal documentation, preparing the motions and filings we'd need. And I would use my knowledge of prosecution strategy to help them build a case so strong that even the best defense attorneys wouldn't be able to create reasonable doubt. I called my parents 2 days later, my voice carefully crafted to sound defeated and broken. I told my father that I couldn't fight anymore, that the investigation and the financial attacks had destroyed me, that I was done. I said I was resigning from the U.S. Attorney's Office, that I was planning to leave New York, maybe go to the West Coast or somewhere far away where I could start over with a different career. I told them I wouldn't interfere with their business, that I just wanted peace, that family was more important than anything else. My father's relief was audible through the phone, his voice relaxing as he said, "That's very wise, Diane. This is for the best." My mother got on the line to say how proud she was that I was being reasonable, how this was the mature choice, how we could all move forward now as a family. Behind the scenes, I was working harder than I'd ever worked in my life. Roland's FBI team had surveillance on my parents and their associates around the clock, documenting every meeting, every transaction, every communication. Marisa was coordinating with federal prosecutors in the Southern District, building the legal framework for a massive RICO case that would encompass not just the Ponzi scheme but the money laundering, the witness tampering, the obstruction of justice. I was compiling evidence, creating timelines, analyzing financial records with the kind of detailed attention that had made me successful in prosecution. We worked 18-hour days, surviving on coffee and determination, knowing that we'd only get one chance to do this right. The full scope of the criminal network was staggering once we pulled all the threads together. The Ponzi scheme had stolen $23 million from 47 identified victims, though we suspected there were more who hadn't come forward out of embarrassment or fear. The money had been hidden in 17 different offshore accounts, spread across the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Panama. Properties had been purchased under false names, luxury items bought through shell companies, all of it carefully structured to avoid detection. My father's partner Lester had a sophisticated operation, with fake account statements, fabricated audit reports, and a network of accomplices who played roles as satisfied investors to convince new victims. Preston's involvement was deeper than just being Bethany's boyfriend. His investment banking position was real, but he was using it as cover for extensive money laundering operations. He specialized in creating complex financial instruments that disguised the origin and destination of illegal funds, helping criminals move money internationally with minimal risk of detection. Had been paid substantial amounts to date Bethany, to integrate himself into my family, and to provide the technical expertise needed to attack me professionally. The relationship my sister thought was based on love was actually a business transaction, with Preston receiving 15% of all funds that he successfully laundered through his banking connections. But Bethany herself was no innocent victim of manipulation. Roland's investigation revealed that she'd been running her own separate fraud scheme, targeting wealthy women through social media and private networking events. She'd created fake investment clubs, promising women-only investment opportunities with high returns and emotional appeals about female financial empowerment. She'd stolen over $3 million personally, money she'd hidden in accounts my parents knew nothing about. Bethany wasn't just the pampered princess. She was a calculating predator who'd learned from watching our parents and had decided to build her own criminal empire. She was, in many ways, more ruthless than Howard and Constance, because she felt no guilt whatsoever, viewing her victims as stupid and deserving of being defrauded. Our first major break came when Lester, my father's partner, made a critical mistake. As part of the FBI's investigation, they'd been monitoring his communications, and they caught him attempting to plant drugs in my car to frame me for possession, with intent to distribute. Roland's team had been conducting surveillance on me for my own protection, documenting all the attacks against me to build obstruction of justice charges. They captured Lester on high-definition video breaking into my car, planting cocaine and methamphetamine, then making an anonymous call to the NYPD to report a federal prosecutor with drugs in her vehicle. When police arrived, Roland's team intercepted them, showed their credentials, and revealed the frame job. Lester was arrested on the spot, facing serious federal charges, and that's when everything started to unravel for my parents. Lester wasn't loyal when faced with 20 years in federal prison. He made a deal within hours, agreeing to testify against everyone involved in exchange for a reduced sentence. He provided detailed testimony about the entire operation, naming every participant, describing every aspect of the fraud, explaining how the money moved and where it was hidden. Most devastatingly, he had recorded conversations with my father, hours of audio where Howard laid out the scheme, discussed how to recruit victims, talked about eliminating threats, including specific discussions about how to destroy me professionally and legally. The recordings were clear, damning, and would be devastating in court. My parents started to realize something was wrong when Lester stopped answering calls and texts. Other associates in their network became nervous, sensing that law enforcement was circling closer. Money transfers that had always gone smoothly suddenly hit roadblocks as banks flagged suspicious activity. But they still didn't suspect me. As far as they knew, I was a broken, defeated woman in California, trying to rebuild a life away from prosecution and family drama. Their biggest mistake was underestimating me, assuming that once I was broken, I would stay broken, that the daughter they'd dismissed their entire life wasn't smart enough or strong enough to fight back. The final piece fell into place when my Uncle Vernon, my mother's brother who'd been the accountant managing the fraudulent books, tried to approach me with a deal. He tracked me down through mutual contacts, not knowing that I was coordinating with the FBI. He offered me $2 million in cash to disappear permanently, to leave the country, to never speak about my family again. I agreed to meet him in a coffee shop in Manhattan, wearing a wire provided by Roland's team. Vernon sat across from me and confessed to everything, thinking he was negotiating my silence but actually providing audio evidence of criminal conspiracy, money laundering, and attempted bribery of a federal official. He detailed how Head created fake financial statements, how Head structured the offshore accounts, how Head helped my parents hide assets and income from the IRS. Every word was recorded in crystal clear quality, and by the end of the 2-hour conversation, we had enough evidence to charge him with multiple federal felonies. With all the evidence compiled and all the participants identified, it was time to spring the trap. Roland coordinated with multiple federal agencies, preparing for simultaneous arrests to prevent anyone from fleeing or destroying evidence. Search warrants were obtained for my parents' home, their offices, their safety deposit boxes, and all the properties tied to their shell companies. Asset seizure orders were prepared to freeze every account and confiscate every piece of property purchased with stolen funds. Most importantly, my name was being completely cleared through official channels, with the Ethics Board receiving comprehensive evidence that all allegations against me had been fabricated as part of a criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice. My parents called me 3 days before the arrests, inviting me to what they called a reconciliation dinner at their home. They wanted to make sure I was really backing off, wanted to see with their own eyes that I was broken and defeated. I agreed immediately, saying I missed family and wanted to put everything behind us. They were pleased, my mother saying how wonderful it would be to have everyone together again. The dinner was scheduled for Saturday evening, a formal affair where Preston and Bethany would also be present, a celebration of their victory over the daughter who'd dared to threaten them. I arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, wearing a simple dress and carrying a purse that contained a sophisticated recording device provided by the FBI. Bethany and Preston were already there, drinks in hand, the atmosphere jovial and relaxed. My father was expansive, making jokes, pouring expensive wine that I knew had been purchased with stolen money. My mother was radiant, discussing plans for their Bahamas vacation property, talking about the furnishings she wanted to buy. They were celebrating, all 4 of them, utterly convinced that they'd successfully neutralized the threat I represented and could continue their criminal enterprise without fear. As dinner progressed and the wine flowed more freely, their guards came down completely. My father, emboldened by alcohol and false security, started boasting about how clever they'd been, how easily they'd fooled the authorities. He detailed specific aspects of their fraud, laughing about investors who'd been too stupid to question the impossibly high returns. My mother added details about how Shed manipulated women at charity events, using emotional appeals about helping others while stealing their savings. Preston explained the money laundering techniques Head used, proud of his technical sophistication, and Bethany, my sister who Id once loved, mocked the victims as greedy and deserving of being defrauded, saying they'd gotten what they deserved for being so gullible. The most chilling moment came when my father, looking directly at me with contempt in his eyes, said, "We're smarter than everyone, including you, Diane. You actually thought you could take us down." My mother added, "You were always the expendable one, dear. Bethany is the daughter we actually love, the one worth protecting." Bethany raised her wine glass and said, "To family that knows its place," while shooting me a triumphant smirk. Preston clinked his glass against hers and said, "You never stood a chance against us." They actually laughed, all 4 of them, celebrating their victory over me while confessing to multiple felonies that were being recorded in perfect audio quality. That's when I stood up from the table, and their laughter died. I said quietly, "Actually, I stood a much better chance than you thought." Right on cue, Geneva walked through the door, the 72-year-old widow whose life savings they'd stolen, accompanied by Roland and a dozen FBI agents. The expressions on my parents' faces shifted from smug satisfaction to confusion to dawning horror as they realized what was happening. Roland announced loudly, "FBI!" Nobody moved while agents poured through every entrance, securing the room and reading rights. The arrests happened simultaneously, with agents placing handcuffs on all 4 of them while reading the extensive list of charges. My father tried to run, actually pushed past an agent and made it 3 steps before being tackled to the floor by 2 more agents. My mother fainted, her body crumpling as the realization hit her, and she had to be carried to a chair while paramedics were called. Bethany screamed, a high-pitched wail of rage and fear, yelling that this wasn't fair, that she hadn't done anything wrong, that I was a traitor and a liar. Preston immediately started trying to negotiate, his lawyer mind kicking in, offering information and cooperation before had even been read his full rights. The charges were extensive and devastating: wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, witness tampering, obstruction of justice, attempted bribery of a federal official, identity theft, and numerous other federal felonies. My father faced 30 to 40 years based on his role as a primary operator. My mother faced similar time for her essential participation and for creating the fake charitable foundation. Bethany's separate fraud scheme added charges that meant 25 to 30 years. Preston's money laundering and professional fraud added up to a potential 30-year sentence. All of their assets were immediately frozen and seized. Every bank account, every property, every expensive item purchased with stolen funds, all of it confiscated to provide restitution to victims. They were denied bail due to flight risk and the severity of charges, with the judge noting they had offshore accounts, foreign contacts, and had already demonstrated willingness to commit serious crimes to avoid prosecution. My father was taken to a federal detention center in handcuffs, his face gray with shock. My mother was hospitalized overnight due to her fainting spell but was then transferred to detention. Bethany and Preston were separated, taken to different facilities, and according to Roland, Bethany had started blaming Preston within hours, while Preston was providing detailed statements about Bethany's involvement. Their fake relationship crumbled instantly under pressure, each trying to save themselves by sacrificing the other. My Uncle Vernon was arrested the same evening at his home, facing 15 years for his role in creating and maintaining the fraudulent accounting. The other associates in the network, including several people from my parents' social circle, were also arrested in coordinated raids across Connecticut and New York. The entire criminal enterprise was dismantled in a single night, years of fraud and theft brought to light, and all of it documented with overwhelming evidence that would make trial outcomes virtually certain. The vindication was complete and official. Within a week, I was fully exonerated of all allegations, with the Ethics Board issuing a formal apology and a public statement explaining that I'd been the victim of a sophisticated criminal conspiracy. I was reinstated to my position at the U.S. Attorney's Office with full back pay for the time I'd been suspended. More than that, I was promoted to senior federal prosecutor in recognition of my work on the case and my integrity in the face of extraordinary personal attacks. I received a commendation from the director of the FBI for my cooperation with the investigation and my courage in exposing the crimes despite the personal cost. My professional reputation wasn't just restored, it was enhanced, and colleagues who'd avoided me were now apologizing and congratulating me with equal fervor. The trial was held 8 months later, covered extensively by media outlets, fascinated by the story of parents who'd tried to frame their own daughter. Geneva testified on the stand, her voice shaking but strong, as she described how my father had befriended her after her husband's death, had seemed so kind and trustworthy, and had stolen everything she'd saved over 40 years of marriage. Other victims testified with similar stories. Elderly people who'd lost homes, families whose children's education funds had vanished, retirees who could no longer afford medical care. The jury listened with expressions of disgust and anger, and several jury members were seen wiping tears as victim after victim described the devastation caused by my family's greed. My parents showed no remorse throughout the trial. My father sat stone-faced, glaring at witnesses, his lawyer presenting technical defenses that rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. My mother cried frequently but only seemed upset about her own situation, never expressing concern for the people they'd hurt. Bethany was the worst, rolling her eyes during victim testimony, sighing dramatically, making it clear she viewed herself as the real victim in this situation. Preston at least had the sense to look appropriately remorseful, though whether that was genuine or calculated for the jury was unclear. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and the jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on every single count for every single defendant. Sentencing day was 3 months after the verdict, and the courtroom was packed with victims, media, and observers. The judge was a woman in her late 60s who had spent 30 years on the bench, and her disgust with the defendants was evident in every word she spoke. She sentenced my father to 38 years in federal prison, noting the scale of the fraud, the vulnerability of the victims, and his complete lack of remorse. My mother received 35 years, with the judge specifically citing her abuse of trust through the fake charity and her role in attempting to frame me. Bethany received 28 years for her fraud scheme and her participation in the conspiracy against me. Preston received 30 years for money laundering and his professional betrayal of banking regulations. My father's final words before being led away were directed at me, his face twisted with rage as he shouted, "You destroyed this family. You're the one who should be in prison." My mother sobbed but only said, "How could you do this to us?" without any acknowledgement of what they'd done to me or their victims. Bethany screamed that I'd always been jealous of her, that I'd ruined everything because I couldn't stand to see her happy. Completely delusional about her own actions and responsibilities. None of them took any responsibility for their crimes, none apologized to their victims, and none showed any genuine remorse for the devastation they'd caused. I felt sad watching them be led away in chains, but it was sadness for what might have been, not for what was, because what was happening was justice being served appropriately. The victims received restitution from the seized assets, though it couldn't make everyone completely whole since much of the money had been spent on luxury items that had depreciated in value. Geneva got her savings back plus interest from the liquidation of my parents' properties, and she sent me a letter afterward that made me cry. She wrote about how her late husband would be proud that justice had been served, how she could finally sleep at night, knowing the people who'd hurt her were being punished, how my courage in standing up to my own family had restored her faith in the legal system. She said I'd honored her husband's memory by fighting for what was right, and that she'd be praying for my healing from the family trauma. That letter meant more to me than any professional recognition possibly could. My own healing took longer and required extensive therapy. I had to process the reality that my parents had never loved me the way parents should love children, that I'd spent 32 years trying to earn affection from people fundamentally incapable of providing it. I had to grieve the family I'd thought I had while accepting the family I actually had, which was no biological family at all. But through therapy and time, I realized I was better off without them, that being rejected by toxic people was actually a blessing. I built a chosen family with Marisa and Roland, who became close friends, and with other prosecutors and agents who'd supported me through the nightmare. These were people who valued integrity, who'd proven their loyalty through actions, who chose to be in my life rather than being stuck with me through accident of biology. I gained a new perspective on my entire childhood through the lens of what had happened. Every time my parents had dismissed my achievements, every time they'd favored Bethany, every time they'd made me feel inadequate, it had actually been because I was different from them in fundamental ways. I had a conscience. I cared about right and wrong. I couldn't be manipulated into accepting unethical behavior just because it benefited me personally. Being the disappointing daughter meant it disappointed people whose values were fundamentally corrupted, and I realized I should have been proud of that all along. Every time they'd rejected me, they'd actually been protecting me from becoming like them, and for that I was grateful. Professionally, I became a leading advocate for victims of financial fraud, particularly fraud perpetrated by family members, which is more common and more devastating than most people realize. I spoke at conferences about the psychological dynamics of familial financial abuse, about the reluctance of victims to report crimes committed by relatives, about the need for specialized training in investigating these cases. I mentored young prosecutors, teaching them to look for patterns of family dysfunction in financial crime cases, sharing what I'd learned from my own nightmare experience. My career flourished in ways it never would have if my parents hadn't attacked me, and I found deep satisfaction in helping others who were facing similar betrayals. The central lesson I carried forward was about the difference between assigned family and chosen family. Blood relation doesn't create obligation when that blood relation is toxic, criminal, or abusive. Real family is built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared values. And those things can exist between people with no biological connection while being completely absent between parents and children. Standing up to my family wasn't betrayal. It was self-preservation and justice. Protecting myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary and right. And choosing truth and integrity over family loyalty wasn't being a traitor. It was being a person with functioning moral compass who understood that some things matter more than genetic connection. I moved forward with my life in ways that felt authentic and fulfilling. I bought a modest home in Brooklyn, nothing like my parents' mansion but mine, purchased with money I'd earned honestly. I focused on work that felt meaningful rather than chasing wealth or status. I developed relationships based on genuine connection rather than obligation or expectation. I found peace in knowing I'd done the right thing, even when the right thing had been extraordinarily difficult and personally costly. And I never regretted exposing my parents, not for a single moment, because the alternative would have been to let them continue destroying lives while I stayed silent to preserve a family that had never really existed. Looking back on that dinner when everything changed, when my mother said, "Don't embarrass us," Diane and I decided to answer Preston's question honestly anyway. I recognized it as the pivotal moment of my life. If I'd stayed silent, if I'd played along with their fiction, I would have become complicit in their crimes through my silence. That one moment of defiance, of choosing truth over their comfort, had saved me from becoming like them and had ultimately brought justice to people who desperately needed it. They'd wanted me not to embarrass them, but I'd done something far more powerful than that. It exposed them, revealed their true nature to the world, and ensured they'd face consequences for the devastation they'd caused. And given the same choice again, knowing everything that would happen, I'd make the exact same decision without hesitation. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right? Have you experienced betrayal from people you thought you could trust? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because I'd love to hear your perspectives and stories. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share this video with anyone who might need to hear that choosing integrity over toxic family is not only acceptable but sometimes necessary. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories about courage, justice, and finding strength in the darkest moments. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and I genuinely hope that if you're facing family dysfunction or betrayal, you'll find the courage to protect yourself and stand up for what's right, no matter how difficult that choice might be. Wishing you all strength, healing, and the wisdom to build the family you deserve, whether that's through blood or through choice. Take care of yourselves, and remember that your integrity is worth more than any relationship built on lies.